regular SQL queries without grouping, each record in the query result refers to or corresponds to a record in the underlying database. We're going to be looking at queries that use the group by clause in SQL today. And in those queries, each result in the query does not refer to an individual record. It actually refers to a grouping, and there's usually an aggregation involved there. It's difficult to understand by definition, but hopefully with some examples it will start to make sense. This is the ER diagram we will be using for these examples today. And so our first question is asking us how many customers live in each state. And without group by queries, we'd probably have to do something like select state from customer and order that by the state, and then count those manually, or we'd have to write 50 separate queries that have counts in them and have a different where clause for each of the different states. Neither of those options appeal to me, but thankfully SQL has a clause called group by that we can use. Well, what we need to start with here is pretty easy. We need to select the state. We want a list of states in our query result, and if we just did this, this would in fact give us a list of states. We would have some duplicates, and so you might be thinking, well, we could probably use the distinct there, but there is a better way. But this is our good starting point. And so what we need after state is a count of the number of records. Unfortunately, if we try to run this right now, we're going to get an error. We don't have a group function in here, and so if select state, that's referring to the state field in the customer table, but count asterisk is referring to a number that is going to correspond to the entire table, right? It's going to be the number of records in the customer table. And so what we need to do is use our first group by clause. And what do we want to group this by? We want to group this by state. So for each state, I want to see the count of customers in that state. And so if we run this, this is now what I'm looking for, right? We have 2 customers in Alaska. We have 2 customers in South Dakota, 62 customers in Minnesota. But we were asked to sort this by the state, and our order by clauses follow the group by clauses. So now I'm going to have an alphabetical list of the states, and actually we're getting some Canadian provinces in here too, like British Columbia and Alberta. But that is answering this question. Let's look at another example. So here again, we're looking for a list of states, but this time it's going to come from our manufacturer table. State is in the database twice, once for customer and once for manufacturer, and we want a list of the manufacturers that have, a list of the states that have more than 3 manufacturers in them, and we're asked to use grouping here. So let's start by selecting our state. That's the first thing we're going to need, and we're also, just like we did in the previous example, we're going to need a count from that manufacturer table. This is coming from the manufacturer table, and again we want to group this by state. Now this says that we're looking for states that have more than 3 manufacturers, and so you might be thinking, okay, we probably need some sort of where clause in here, but where clauses refer to records, whereas having, a new SQL keyword we use with group by clauses, is going to refer to groups. And so it's the groups that we want to see that have at least 3 manufacturers in those particular states. And so this is the first time we're going to use our having clause, having a count of basically the records in the manufacturer table greater than 3. And so this count asterisk greater than 3 is going to correspond to each of the states, because that is how we are grouping this query. And so now if I run this, we'll see that these four states here have at least 3 manufacturers in them. This third example is a group by query that's going to require us to join 2 tables. So the first thing we need here is the manufacturer name from the manufacturer table. And then we're asked for the average price, and the product price is coming from our product table. And this data is coming from 2 tables. Let's start with the manufacturer table. Oops, my apologies. From the manufacturer table, we're going to join that to the product table on, and then if we look at our ER diagram, we can see that the product and manufacturer table are joined on the manufacturer ID field. And now we need to group this by something. We need to group it by the name of the manufacturer. And every field that's listed up here in our select clause that is not an aggregate function like this. This is an aggregate function. It's aggregating several fields, the price fields, into one, an average of those. If a field is not an aggregate and it's in our select clause, that means it needs to be in our group by clause. So this is what we're grouping it by, and then we want for manufacturers that have an average price above 100. You might be thinking, well, should we do where a price is greater than 100? We don't want to do that because we are looking for filtering this data on the groups, not necessarily on the individual products. So that means we need to use our having statement, and having an average price of greater than $100. So if I run this, we only have one manufacturer in the database that has an average product price greater than $100. So in our final example, we're going to have several fields in the group by, or in the select clause, meaning we'll have to have several fields also in the group by clause. And so we need first the customer's first name. We need their last name, the customer ID, and the number of sales. And so we need to use our count. Whenever we're looking for the number of something, we're usually using a count field. And count is an aggregate function just like sum or average or min or max. And so what do we want to count? We want to count the number of sales. And so I'm going to count the number of sale ID fields in the sale table. And this will be another column in our database. And I can give this an alias of number of sales. This data is coming from first the customer table, and we need to join that to the sale table because we have these 3 fields coming from the customer table and then this field coming from the sale table. So how are these 2 tables joined? If we look at our ER diagram, we can see that customer ID in the customer field corresponds to customer ID in the sale field. And so let's specify that relationship. And now a group by clause. This group by clause is going to be larger than the other ones. Why? Because this is an aggregate function, therefore it does not need to be in our group by clause. But customer first name, customer last name, and customer ID All three of these are not aggregate functions. Therefore, if they're not aggregate functions and they're in my select clause, they need to be in my group by clause as well. And we can separate each one of these with a comma and put them each on their own lines. So there's our group by clause, and now having. Why? Because we want customers that have made at least 25 purchases. And each customer in this query result is going to be a group. We are grouping customers because we're also bringing in the sales that they've had. One customer can have many sales, but we're not going to see each of those customers duplicated, say 5 times if they've made 5 sales. We're only going to see them once because we are grouping by customer. Since customer is our group, that's what we need to filter on, and therefore we're going to do that in the having clause. So having what? Having a count of that sale ID of greater than or equal to 25. So these are good customers, customers who have made many purchases at our company. And so that was a long query, and now we're going to get a list of our very good customers. So if you see Magnus Ramage has made 40 individual purchases on our website, and Roxanne Whalen has made 26 purchases at the company. And so each one of these numbers is 25 or larger. So our best customers are shown in this particular group by query.